They say that certain disappearances do not fade with time, they only deepen, like marks carved into the old wood of a boarding school that no longer exists. Before continuing, the narrator leaves a calm, discreet sentence hanging in the air, one that does not break the silence of the story. Leave a comment saying which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. Willowmoor Academy appeared in 1885 as an isolated spot on the map of Harrowfield County, amid wet fields, sloping willows, and a constant wind that blew through the tall windows as if always searching for something. It was a respected girls' boarding school, maintained by wealthy families who believed that their daughters, far from the noise of growing cities, would find a balance between discipline and refinement at Willowmoor. The main building, dark brick, 3 stories, iron staircases, and an attic that was rarely mentioned, seemed older than the founding records themselves. The 22 boarding students formed a small microcosm of the era. Girls aged 14 to 17, with surnames familiar from the local newspapers, daughters of merchants, upwardly mobile railroad workers, and a few discreet heiresses. They shared cramped dormitories, thick wool uniforms, and a meticulous daily routine dictated by the central bell. The early mornings were freezing, marked by the distant smell of coal from the boiler, while the afternoons were filled with classes in English literature, calligraphy, and posture, a subject curiously valued by the headmistress, the severe Margaret Collingwood. The atmosphere at Willowmoor, according to preserved accounts, was one of almost uncomfortable quiet. Not because of fights or conflicts between the girls, but because of the way the boarding school seemed to stifle sounds, intentions, and even emotions. Testimonies suggest that the students spoke softly, as if the building itself educated the tone of their voices. The wind blew against the shutters, and inside, the silence remained intact, rigid, observed. Documents from the time described the discipline as ironclad yet fair. But manuscripts found decades later, hidden in municipal archives, suggest a rigidity that went beyond what was acceptable. The attic, for example, was not included in the official architectural report submitted to the county. And yet, all the internal floor plans hand-drawn by the teachers mentioned an upper space called the upper attic, reserved for corrections and contemplation. There was never a consensus on what exactly that meant. Until the day of the disappearance, Willowmoor continued at its methodical pace. Students were seen crossing the stone courtyard, walking in line toward the cafeteria, their silhouettes forming an image so organized that some visitors said it looked like a living painting. But in the notes left by an assistant teacher, Clara M. Reeves, there is a discreet observation about an unusual atmosphere in the weeks leading up to the events. Small, silent tensions between the girls, glances that avoided meeting each other, a feeling that something was being kept secret. The historian who recounts this story, decades later, admits that the case initially seemed like just another unexplained tragedy. But then, when comparing official records with loose notes found in trunks and corroded folders, one name began to repeat itself in an unsettling way: Lydia Harroway. She was not presented as a protagonist, nor as a leader or a problematic student. In fact, in the traditional documents, her name hardly appeared. But in the misplaced papers, especially in Professor Reeves's torn notebook, Lydia appeared in unlikely places. Attendance lists where she shouldn't have been, contradictory behavior notes, and a note that barely survived the humidity of the years. Lydia didn't sleep. She heard footsteps. The others heard them too. It was as if, instead of being more visible, Lydia was marked by a kind of documentary shadow. Too much presence where there was silence, too much silence where there should have been a record. And this discrepancy, as subtle as it was disturbing, would become the first crack in the polished surface of Willowmoor Academy. This detail, almost lost among yellowed papers, led the researcher to revisit the old floor plan of the building. And that's when a forgotten element resurfaced. The entrance to the attic, hidden behind a narrow door that did not appear in official reports, but, curiously, was mentioned in 3 different statements by teachers. All the paths, all the gaps, and all the inconsistencies of 1885 began to converge on that forbidden space. And according to the latest reliable records, that was where the 22 students were last seen. To understand what happened that spring of 1885, it is necessary to patiently reconstruct the daily lives of the 22 boarding students at Willowmoor Academy. The records recovered from the county, combined with unfinished letters and notes left by teachers, allow us to observe a vivid, albeit fragmented, picture of life within those cold walls. What emerges is not only a disciplined environment, but an atmosphere that seemed to shape every gesture, every thought, every movement of the young women. The days always began at 5:45 a.m., when the iron bell was rung by the head inspector, Mrs. Aldergrove. The girls woke up almost simultaneously, as if the sound vibrated within them, and filed in single file to the communal wash basin, where the water, almost always ice-cold, ran into metal basins. The morning silence was not imposed. It simply existed, naturalized by habit. From the very first day, the students learned that talking too much was synonymous with vanity and distraction. After breakfast, brown bread, porridge, and weak tea, they headed to their classrooms. The most prestigious subject was literature and rhetoric, taught by Professor Eleanor Wells, described in the documents as severe but remarkably sensitive to the intellectual posture of young women. It is curious to note how, despite institutional rigidity, there was room for reading and reflection. The students spent long afternoons underlining words, copying excerpts, and comparing interpretations. And in the midst of this process, silent affinities began to emerge. Reports suggest that the girls organized themselves into small groups, not out of declared affinity, but out of an almost intuitive emotional closeness. 3 of them were inseparable on walks in the courtyard. 4 others shared a love of drawing and sewing. 6 others preferred to discuss poems in low whispers near the willow trees. These groupings changed little over time, but in the weeks before the disappearance, something began to alter this order. Letters sent to parents, especially those from Marybeth Clark and Annabeth Rowan, mentioned that the atmosphere seemed different, although none of them explained what that meant. The teachers, in turn, recorded episodes of nocturnal restlessness, footsteps in the dormitory, whispers that ceased abruptly when an authority figure approached, quick glances exchanged between the older students, and Lydia Haraway, whose presence in the archives is curiously irregular, seemed to be at the center of this subtle movement, not because of her leadership, but because of her sensitivity. A note found in the diary of another student, Helena Grafton, states, "Lydia hasn't slept well this week. She wakes up tense, as if she hears something no one else hears. The others ask her about it, but she just says it was the wind." However, the winds of Willowmoor were old acquaintances to all, and had never disturbed the sleep of these young women to the point of generating comments. What then was Lydia hearing? In the dining halls, the students behaved as usual, but with small disruptions. Some meals were eaten in deep silence, as if an important subject were being avoided. At other times, groups that had previously been chatting quietly would abruptly split up, as if a latent tension had arisen between them. Teacher Reeves, always observant, noted in her notebook, "The usual harmony has been broken by something I don't know. There are no fights, but there is fear." In addition, it is noteworthy how the building itself began to be mentioned more frequently in the records. The third-floor hallway, where the narrow door leading to the forbidden attic was located, began to appear in notes that should not have existed. One student wrote, almost without context, "Today we passed by there again. Lydia didn't want to look." This type of observation, so trivial and yet so loaded with meaning, allows us to speculate that the upper attic had acquired a presence in the girls' imagination. Even without direct descriptions, it hung over them like a possibility, a rumor, a place that was little talked about and much thought about. Another relevant clue appears in one of the last letters Marybeth sent to her mother. "The principal has been stricter. She watches us during walks. And there's something strange about the inspectors. I can't explain it, but they seem more attentive than usual." None of this, however, was addressed in the official reports. This dissonance between what was reported to families and what was actually happening inside Willowmoor is fundamental. It shows that before the disappearance, there was a kind of silent tension growing in the corridors. Something that involved interrupted conversations, restless nights, and a vague feeling that there was information circulating among the students that the teachers were unaware of, or pretended to be unaware of. The researcher who reconstructed these facts notes that the more he analyzed the testimonies, the more evident a kind of unspoken agreement among the girls became. It was not necessarily a pact. It seemed more like a common understanding that certain things should not be discussed openly. And Lydia, always Lydia, seemed to be the fragile piece of this balance. Once, during a silent reading class, Teacher Wells reported seeing Lydia staring at the ceiling as if listening to a distant sound. No other student reacted, but Wells noted, "Lydia heard something, I don't know what, but she heard it." The building with its old beams creaked naturally, but that episode occurred in the middle of the afternoon, with no wind, no movement, no reason. As the weeks went by, the reports converged on one point. The students were changing, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but changing, and this process would culminate on a specific night, the last night they were all seen walking together down the third-floor hallway, the same night that, according to a torn record, the attic door was unlocked. The night of May 12, 1885, would be recorded years later as the last time the 22 students were seen alive inside Willowmoor Academy. To accurately reconstruct what happened, the researcher turned to a mosaic of fragments, notes from Teacher Reeves, late statements from inspectors, and an almost illegible sheet of paper retrieved from the rubble when the building was demolished. Together, these accounts compose a silent but disturbingly coherent narrative. The day had passed in an ordinary manner, or at least ordinary for the atmosphere that Willowmoor carried in its final weeks. The wind blew in from the fields, carrying a scent of damp earth that seeped even into the inner corridors. Classes were taught as usual, and the girls followed their routine of reading and practicing calligraphy. However, a few isolated observations suggest that the students were particularly tense that day. Inspector Aldergrove reported in a statement given 4 years later that she noticed unusual movement among the older students during twilight. She described abrupt whispers that stopped when she approached and exchanged glances between girls who normally showed no affinity for each other. But when questioned, they all denied any relevant issues. "Curiously polite," she said, "but restless." After dinner, boiled potatoes, thin broth, and slices of bread, the students were released for contemplative hour, a short period before curfew when they were supposed to remain in their dormitories reading or writing letters. It is during this interval that the first discrepancies between the records arise. A note from Professor Wells states that she saw Lydia Haraway walking down the third-floor hallway at 8:40 p.m., holding a small fabric-covered notebook. Wells found it strange that Lydia was unaccompanied. Students rarely circulated alone after sunset, but did not approach her. However, a statement taken decades later from an inspector says that she saw Lydia in her dormitory at that same time. Both versions cannot be true, and yet they are the only existing accounts of that specific minute. From 9 o'clock onwards, the boarding school fell into absolute silence. The bell rang, the lamps were lowered, and the wind seemed to increase in intensity outside, howling against the walls. The researcher points out that most testimonies mention the wind that night, not as something strange, but as something present, insistent, dominating the soundscape of Willowmoor. Around 9:20, according to Ms. Reeves's torn record, light footsteps echoed in the third-floor hallway. She wrote, "I heard what sounded like many bare feet walking together, but at a pace that sounded restrained, almost ceremonious. When she approached the door to check, she saw nothing, but the pen mark on her paper shows hesitation. It was as if she was sure that someone, or several people, had passed by." The last confirmed visual report of the girls appears on a draft sheet, recovered years later from Teacher Reeves's desk. It reads, 22 girls going up. Absolute silence. Lydia looks back, and there is no date, but the ink indicates a temporal correlation with the other documents from that week. The sentence is short, concise, written in haste, and yet it is the most crucial fragment for understanding what followed. At 9:35, the building recorded an unusual event. The light in the third-floor hallway went out on its own. At least that is what Inspector Rowley's report states, the only official document mentioning lighting irregularities that night. He went upstairs to turn it back on, but stopped when he noticed that the narrow door, which should have remained locked, was only ajar. There is no consensus on what Rowley saw or failed to see at that moment. His testimony, given in 1901, was already fragile, marked by memory lapses. He said he pushed the door cautiously and smelled the scent of old wood and stored fabric. He heard no voices, but he heard something he described as a slight shift in air, as if someone were moving inside. He called out to one of the inspectors, but no one answered. Upon returning to the hallway, he noted something that remains puzzling. The row of marks on the floor looks recent. Marks? From shoes? From dragging? It is not known. The document does not specify. Shortly thereafter, a sequence of noises was recorded by different people in different parts of the building. Professor Wells said she heard a single sharp sound coming from above. Inspector Aldergrove, who was in the cafeteria turning off lamps, said she heard something like a prolonged creak. The cook's version, taken much later, mentions a light thud, followed by a deep silence. All of these sounds occurred between 9:49 and 9:53. None of them were investigated at the time. The researcher emphasizes that it is precisely this interval that forms the heart of the mystery. It was in this space of a few minutes that all evidence points to the students having gone to the attic. But why and how remains unfathomable. Reeves's notebook contains another note, probably written that same night, although the time was not recorded. The beds are empty, all 22 of them. Total silence in the hallway. This excerpt, found among loose sheets of paper, is the only one that states that the students were simultaneously absent from the dormitories before the nightly rounds. And then comes the last piece of confirmed evidence. At 10 o'clock sharp, Inspector Aldergrove made her usual rounds. She noted that the second and first floors were in order. When she reached the third floor, however, she saw something she couldn't explain. The attic door was wide open and the lamps were off, even though she herself had checked their brightness hours earlier. The hallway, normally cold, was warmer than usual, as if many people had passed through it shortly before. And on the floor, right next to the open door, there was a small, almost imperceptible object, a dark blue uniform button, typical of older students. The inspector picked it up, put it in her pocket, and climbed a single step of the narrow staircase, but she immediately backed away. In a later statement, she summed up her experience in a few words. The feeling was one of total absence. Aldergrove did not specify what she meant by that. Absence of sound, of movement, of air. The document remains vague, but what is most disturbing is what comes next. She called for Reeves, she called for Wells, she called for the inspectors. No one heard her. It was only half an hour later, at 10:30, that they managed to form a small group to go up to the attic. And when they finally pushed the door open completely, carrying lit lanterns and clipboards to record any occurrences, they found only dust suspended in the air, and the most absolute silence ever recorded at that boarding school. None of the 22 students were there. No signs of a struggle, no marks from a fall, no direct material evidence, only absence. And a single detail that would continue to haunt investigators for decades. Footprints forming a trail that ended exactly in the center of the attic and simply disappeared there, as if no student had taken the next step. News of the disappearance of the 22 students spread slowly and unevenly throughout Harrowfield County, as was the case with all serious events at the turn of the 19th century. There were no immediate headlines, no public fanfare. In the early days, Headmistress Collingwood insisted on treating the episode as a collective evasion, an expression that had never been used before in the educational records of the time. The school, however, never presented any evidence of escape. The gates remained locked. The windows were intact, and none of the students' personal items were missing. The boarding school entered a state of silent unrest. Teachers walked the halls with tense steps, inspectors repeated their rounds without a clear destination, and the cafeteria served meals to empty tables. The lamps remained lit longer, and the air seemed heavier, as if the very structure of Willowmoor were unable to sustain the event. The county search team arrived on the third day, led by Sheriff Abram Holt, a practical man averse to speculation. His subsequent reports record what he described as the most baffling case of his career. The first step was to search the forbidden attic. 10 men, equipped with ropes, flashlights, and inspection boards, searched the place inch by inch. They found dust, old boxes, scraps of fabric, books damaged by time, but no organic traces to suggest that 22 young people had stayed there. The trail of footsteps, recorded by Inspector Aldergrove, was still partially visible in some places, although weaker after so much movement. Most frustrating for Holt was the way it ended abruptly in the center of the room, with no dispersion, no continuity, no physical logic whatsoever. He mentioned this fact in 3 different statements, always with the same reluctant tone. They looked like footsteps coming in, but not footsteps going out. The search extended to the fields surrounding the school. Men on horseback covered miles of rough terrain. Sniffer dogs were brought in from a neighboring town. Streams were examined. Nothing was found. The absence of physical traces led the county to suspect collusion within the boarding school itself, not through malice, but through omission. Many questions were directed at Principal Collingwood. Why was the attic door unlocked? Why was there no report on the use of that space? Why did so many students seem restless in the weeks leading up to the incident? Collingwood answered almost everything with the same phrase, "I don't know." Her silence fueled more doubts than certainties. Families began arriving at Willowmoor even before the school made the disappearance official. Mothers and fathers, dressed prematurely in black, walked through the gate with expressions of disbelief. They entered the dormitories, touched the untouched clothes, opened marked books, read letters interrupted mid-paragraph. Some begged for answers, others accused the administration. There were screams, breakdowns, pleas. The school, which had always cultivated an atmosphere of order, was overcome by a diffuse pain, divided into 22 versions of despair. And among all the parents, only one family reacted differently: the Harraways. County documents indicate that Lydia's father, railroad worker Charles Harraway, remained almost completely silent during the searches. He walked the halls with a disconcerting calm, as if he were more focused on observing the structure of the building than questioning authorities. In a statement taken years later, Sheriff Holt said he found Harraway alone on the 3rd floor, standing in front of the attic door, staring at the hinges. When Holt asked if he needed anything, Harraway replied only, "She shouldn't be here." The researcher highlights this phrase as a possible emotional turning point. While the other parents sought explanations, Harraway seemed to carry a silent knowledge, something that was not about his daughter's transgression, but about a displacement, an inadequacy, a feeling that Lydia somehow did not belong in that environment from the beginning. This is reinforced when we analyze a letter found decades later among the family's belongings. A draft never sent, written in Lydia's shaky handwriting. The letter read, "Dad, sometimes I feel like the others know something I don't. I don't know if I've done something wrong or if I just can't hear what they hear. Whatever it is, it's on the 3rd floor." These words, though vague, became one of the key pieces of the historical investigation. They do not suggest explicit danger. They suggest perception, sensitivity, an awareness that was not shared by the others. Over the next 2 weeks, testimonies began to diverge. One teacher claimed to have heard the girls walking in single file, another denied it. One inspector said she had seen lights in the attic before the disappearance. Another insisted that the door had always been locked. Principal Collingwood, under pressure from the county, admitted that she occasionally allowed minor disciplinary corrections to be applied on the 3rd floor, but never explained the nature of these corrections. The researcher draws attention to a detail that is almost always overlooked: the timing of Teacher Reeves's notes. She recorded footsteps, silence, and empty beds even before Aldergrove noticed the door wide open. This suggests that Reeves knew more than she wrote, or at least sensed that something was about to happen. Reeves, however, never formally stated anything. Shortly thereafter, she abandoned her career and moved to a distant city, where she lived into old age without ever speaking publicly about Willowmoor. The case was officially closed after 4 months of fruitless searches. The report's conclusion is dry and bureaucratic. The 22 students were reported missing without identified cause. There was no ceremony, no memorial. The families buried empty coffins and returned to their daily lives as if it were possible to resume any kind of normality. Willowmoor Academy, however, never recovered. The building lost students, lost its reputation, and lost its life, until, years later, it closed its doors. When it was demolished, part of its structure revealed something that was not mentioned in any report. The attic staircase had been reinforced with new beams shortly before the disappearance. Who ordered the reinforcement? Why? In what context? There is no answer. But the researcher finds, among abandoned documents, a final record by Professor Reeves, probably written the day after the tragedy. The room seemed full, but empty, as if they were there and they weren't. And Lydia left something behind, though I still don't know what. And then comes the final revelation, not of what happened, but of what remained. Among the objects collected in the attic was a second dark blue button, identical to the first. But this one bore, engraved on the inside, something no one expected to find. The initial of a name that should never have been there. L. The same symbol found on the inside collar of Lydia's uniform. A lost button, or a button left behind. No one could say. But all the lines of investigation, all the clues, and all the silences in the case seemed to point to one inescapable fact. Lydia Haraway was at the center of Willowmoor Academy's last night, but she was not alone. Decades have passed since that night at Willowmoor, and yet there is something about the case of the 22 students that resists the erosion of time. The researcher, who has devoted much of his life to reconstructing the episode, often says that some disappearances do not belong to the realm of answers. They belong to the realm of marks. And Willowmoor, in all its gaps, has become just that, a silent, persistent mark, inscribed in the memory of a community that no longer exists. The official archives are incomplete. Many have been lost, others destroyed, and some simply ignored by 19th century bureaucracy. What remains today is a collection of fragments scattered in wooden boxes, steel drawers, diaries of long-dead teachers, and letters never sent. When these fragments are lined up, what emerges is not an explanation, but a portrait, the image of a boarding school that lived under invisible tension, of students who carried silent fears, of a headmistress who failed to protect, and of a young woman, Lydia Haraway, who seemed to see cracks that no one else saw. The building, demolished in 1903, was never rebuilt. The land where Willowmoor Academy once stood was sold to a farmer who grew wheat for many years without knowing of the events that had taken place there. It is said that while plowing the land, he occasionally found small objects, fragments of dark wood, pieces of fabric, corroded hardware. None of them were officially associated with the boarding school, but they were all stored in a trunk. When the farmer died, his family donated these items to the municipal archives. They remain there to this day, unclassified, as remnants of a school life that was undone in a single stroke. Upon examining these objects, the researcher realized that the mystery of Willowmoor was never in what was missing, but in what was left behind. The silences, the hesitations, the averted glances, the incomplete sentences. Teacher Reeves's notes, brief and restrained, suggest someone who witnessed more than she should have, but who never had the courage to write everything down. Her last note, "Lydia left something behind," remains a kind of echo, a line that seems to point to a meaning that was lost before it could be understood. And the figure of Lydia, emerging from gaps and documentary shadows, is perhaps the most striking element of the case. Not because she is the culprit, nor because she is an exceptional victim, but because her presence, or her perception, seems to have been the thread that tied the other 21 together. There is something delicate and deeply human in the way she appears in the records, not as a leader nor as a transgressor, but as someone who carried a sense of displacement that no one could decipher. A young woman who heard things that others ignored, or perhaps just felt more intensely. Reflecting on this, the researcher concludes that Willowmoor's disappearance cannot be interpreted as an isolated event, but as a process. Weeks of tension, sleepless nights, footsteps in the hallway, forced silences, heavy glances. The disappearance itself was only the final sentence in a story written slowly over months. A story that no one read in its entirety. The families, of course, never found comfort. They buried empty coffins, kept pictures on the walls, and saved incomplete letters. Some mothers wrote to their daughters even years later, as if the absence could be filled by words that would never reach their destination. Other families left the county, unable to remain in a place that held memories without bodies. The community, which had once viewed Willowmoor as a symbol of discipline and prestige, began to avoid it, until finally the building was closed and left to decay. The most curious thing, however, is not in the stories that were told, but in those that never were. Many teachers who could have offered answers left the county and remained silent until the end of their lives. Inspectors changed their versions over the years. Principal Collingwood died without writing a line about Willowmoor in her last personal files. It is as if all the adults who lived through that period carried a weight that did not dissolve with time. A weight made of uncertainty, guilt, and impossibility. In the end, the only certainty that remains is absence. Not absence as a strange phenomenon, but as a human mark. The absence of girls in the hallways, the absence of clear explanations, the absence of answers in the documents. And it is this absence more than any theory that gives the Willowmoor case its melancholic permanence. The researcher usually ends his lectures on the boarding school with a phrase that does not seek to decipher what happened, but rather to situate the case in the field of memory. Sometimes, what disappears is not what is gone, but what we never managed to understand. And when he closes his notes, the image that remains is not that of the open attic door, nor the interrupted footprints, nor the contradictory testimonies. The image that remains is that of the 22 students walking in line down the hallway minutes before they disappeared. The silent row, the synchronized footsteps, the young faces lit only by the dim lamp, and Lydia at the end of the line, looking over her shoulder one last time, as if she knew that this movement would be irreversible, and as if she left, in her gaze, the last question that never found an answer. The last question that, to this day, causes anyone who studies the case to remain silent for a few moments.